everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
A quiet beginning. When I first arrived in the United States, I believed I was prepared for everything. I had spent months reading about American culture. I watched videos about life in America. I practiced English every day. I imagined myself making friends, finding opportunities, and building a better future. Reality had other plans. The first thing that surprised me was the silence. Many people think America is always loud and busy. Some places are. But the neighborhood where I moved was quiet. Very quiet. Every morning, I woke up in a small rented house on a peaceful street lined with trees. The houses looked beautiful. The lawns were neatly cut. Cars sat quietly in driveways. Birds sang in the distance. It looked perfect. But inside, I felt completely alone. I could understand simple English when people spoke slowly. However, real conversations felt different. Americans often spoke faster than I expected. They used expressions I had never learned in school. Sometimes I understood only half of what people were saying. Sometimes less. Because of this, I started avoiding conversations. At grocery stores, I chose self-checkout machines. At coffee shops, I ordered the same thing every time because I was afraid of making mistakes. When neighbors waved, I smiled politely but rarely spoke. I told myself that I needed more time. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The loneliness grew quietly. Scientists often explain that human connection is one of the most important factors for emotional well-being. Studies show that isolation can increase stress and reduce motivation. Looking back, I did not need a scientific study to understand this. I felt it every day. I would sit at my small kitchen table after work, staring out the window. The evenings felt especially difficult. The sky would slowly turn orange. Families returned home. Children played in front yards. Neighbors talked to each other. And I sat alone. One evening, I remember asking myself a painful question. What if I never belong here? That question stayed in my mind longer than I wanted to admit. The strange thing about discouragement is that it rarely arrives all at once. It enters quietly. One small disappointment. One awkward conversation. One lonely evening. Then another. And another. Before you realize it, the feeling starts building a home inside your mind. I continued practicing English. I continued working. I continued pretending everything was fine. But deep down, I was losing confidence. One Saturday morning, I woke up feeling particularly frustrated. The weather was beautiful. The sun was shining. Yet I had no desire to go anywhere. I made coffee and sat near the front window. That was when I noticed him. An older man was standing in the yard next door. I had seen him before. He appeared to be in his 70s. Gray hair. Simple clothes. A calm expression. Nothing unusual. He was watering flowers near his porch. For some reason, he looked up and noticed me sitting by the window. I immediately looked away. A few seconds later, curiosity made me glance back. To my surprise, he was smiling. Not a quick smile. Not a polite smile. A genuine smile. The kind that makes you feel noticed. Then he waved. Instinctively, I waved back. That should have been the end of it. A simple moment. A simple greeting. Nothing important. At least, that is what I thought. The next morning, I saw him again. And again he waved. The day after that, the same thing happened. Soon, I started expecting it. Every morning. The wave. The smile. The quiet acknowledgement that another human being existed nearby. It sounds small. Almost insignificant. But something inside me began changing. Psychologists often talk about the power of repeated positive interactions. Tiny moments of kindness can gradually reshape how people see themselves and the world around them. At the time, I knew nothing about psychology. I only knew that his smile somehow made the neighborhood feel less lonely. Then one afternoon, everything changed. I had just returned from work. My mind was full of stress. Bills. Responsibilities. Uncertainty. Questions about my future. As I walked toward my front door, I heard a voice behind me. Beautiful day, isn't it? I turned around. It was him. The neighbor. For a second, panic appeared. The same fear I always felt before speaking English. What if I misunderstood him? What if I said something wrong? What if the conversation became awkward? But then something unexpected happened. His eyes showed patience. Not judgment. Not impatience. Just kindness. I took a breath. Then I answered slowly. Yes, it is a beautiful day. He smiled. See? Your English is better than you think. Those 7 words hit me harder than he could possibly imagine. Because for months, I had focused on everything I could not do. Everything I did not know. Every mistake I made. Yet this stranger saw something different. Potential. Hope. Possibility. I did not know his name yet. I did not know his story. I certainly did not know that he would eventually influence my career, my confidence, my marriage, and even the future of my children. At that moment, he was simply an old American neighbor standing under the afternoon sun. But sometimes the biggest chapters of our lives begin with the smallest sentences. And I was about to discover that this simple conversation was only the beginning of a journey that would change everything I thought I knew about friendship, love, family, and the meaning of home. The most surprising part? The neighbor who changed my future had been carrying a secret story of his own all along. And when I finally learned that story, nothing would ever be the same again. The neighbor next door. There is a strange truth about life that most people discover too late. Sometimes the person who changes your future is not a teacher, a boss, a family member, or even someone you love. Sometimes it is simply the person living a few feet away from your front door. After my first real conversation with the neighbor next door, I expected life to continue as usual. I thought we would exchange a few greetings and then return to our separate routines. Instead, something unexpected began happening. Every morning when I stepped outside, he seemed to appear at exactly the right moment. Sometimes he was watering flowers. Sometimes he was checking the mailbox. Sometimes he was sitting on his porch drinking coffee while watching the sunrise. Every time he saw me, he smiled and said hello. At first our conversations lasted less than 30 seconds. Good morning. Nice weather today. How was work? Simple sentences. Very simple English. That was what surprised me the most. He never used difficult words. He never spoke too quickly. He never made me feel embarrassed when I searched for the right sentence. Looking back, I realize he was doing something powerful without announcing it. He was creating a safe space for me to practice speaking. Psychologists often explain that people learn faster when anxiety is reduced. When the brain feels safe, communication becomes easier. Confidence begins to grow. Without realizing it, my neighbor was helping me overcome one of my biggest obstacles. His name was Robert. I learned that about a week after our first conversation. "Call me Robert," he said with a smile. "Everybody does." He lived alone in the small blue house next door. The house was older than most others in the neighborhood. The paint showed signs of age. The wooden porch creaked whenever he walked across it. Yet somehow the place felt warm and welcoming. Colorful flowers surrounded the front yard. Wind chimes danced gently whenever a breeze passed through. An American flag hung quietly beside the front door. Every detail seemed to tell a story. One afternoon Robert invited me to sit on the porch for a few minutes. I almost said no. The old version of me would have found an excuse. Too busy. Too tired. Maybe another time. But something felt different now. So I accepted. That simple decision became one of the most important decisions of my life. We sat in rocking chairs while the late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the street. Children laughed in the distance. Birds moved between the trees. For the first time since arriving in America, I felt like I was part of the neighborhood instead of merely observing it. Robert asked questions about my life. Not the kind of questions people ask out of politeness. Real questions. Where was I from? Why had I come to America? What dreams was I chasing? What challenges was I facing? At first I answered carefully. I was still nervous about my English. Yet Robert listened with patience. He never interrupted. He never corrected every mistake. He focused on understanding instead of judging. Researchers studying communication often say that feeling heard is one of the deepest human needs. Sitting on that porch, I finally understood what they meant. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. When I returned home that evening, something unusual happened. I felt lighter. My problems had not disappeared. My bills were still waiting. My responsibilities remained the same. Yet somehow the weight on my shoulders felt smaller. Human connection can do that. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. We talked regularly. Sometimes for 5 minutes. Sometimes for 30. Through these conversations, I started learning things about American culture that no textbook had ever taught me. Robert explained why neighbors often chat casually even if they are not close friends. He explained why community events matter in small towns. He explained the unwritten rules of American social life. Things that seemed confusing before suddenly began making sense. More importantly, I started speaking English more naturally. My confidence improved little by little. Not dramatically. Not overnight. Just enough to notice. One day I ordered something different at a restaurant without rehearsing the sentence in my head 10 times first. Another day I started a conversation with a cashier. Small victories. Tiny moments. Yet each one felt important. Then one morning Robert asked a question that caught me completely off guard. Do you know why most people fail? I expected a complicated answer. Maybe something about money. Education. Opportunity. Instead, he shook his head and smiled. Because they quit talking to people. I laughed. He did not. I'm serious, he said. People isolate themselves. They stop asking questions. They stop building relationships. Then they wonder why life feels hard. His words stayed with me for days. The more I thought about them, the more they made sense. Many opportunities come through human connections. Many solutions arrive through conversations. Yet fear often convinces us to stay silent. Fear had certainly done that to me. A few days later, I noticed something interesting. Robert seemed to know almost everyone in the neighborhood. People waved when they drove by. Children greeted him by name. Delivery drivers stopped to chat. It was as if he had become part of the community itself. I wondered how he had built so many relationships. More importantly, I wondered why he seemed so interested in helping me. One evening, while we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I finally asked him, "Why are you always so kind to me?" For a moment, Robert became unusually quiet. His eyes followed the orange glow stretching across the horizon. Then he smiled softly. Because somebody once did the same for me. That answer created more questions than it solved. Who had helped him? What had happened in his past? Why did his voice sound different when he spoke those words? For the first time, I sensed that Robert was carrying a story much bigger than the friendly conversations we shared each day. There was history behind his smile. There was pain behind his kindness. There was a reason he understood loneliness so well. I did not know it yet, but the secret hidden inside Robert's past would soon change the way I viewed success, relationships, and even my own future. And when he finally decided to tell me the truth, I would discover that the man who seemed to have everything figured out had once stood exactly where I was standing now, lost, uncertain, and desperately searching for a reason not to give up. Small talks, big lessons. Most people underestimate the power of a 5-minute conversation. They imagine life-changing moments as dramatic events filled with excitement, risk, and unforgettable decisions. Yet some of the biggest transformations begin with ordinary words spoken on an ordinary afternoon. Looking back now, I can honestly say that many of the lessons that shaped my future did not come from books, courses, or motivational speeches. They came from simple conversations with my American neighbor, Robert. At first, our talks remained casual. We discussed the weather, local events, and everyday life in our small town. But gradually, something interesting happened. Each conversation became a lesson hidden inside a story. Robert never sounded like a teacher. He never lectured. He never claimed to have special wisdom. Instead, he shared observations about life, culture, and people in a way that made complex ideas feel surprisingly simple. One Saturday morning, we were sitting on his porch drinking coffee when I mentioned something that had been bothering me for months. Sometimes I feel like I don't understand Americans, I admitted. Robert laughed softly. Most Americans don't understand Americans either. That answer caught me off guard. He smiled and continued. The United States is a big place. Different regions have different cultures. Different families have different traditions. Different communities have different values. There isn't just one American culture. That conversation opened my eyes. Before moving to the United States, I had imagined Americans as one group with similar habits and beliefs. Reality was much more interesting. Robert explained how people from Texas might sound different from people in New York. Families in California might live differently than families in Ohio. Even within the same neighborhood, lifestyles could vary dramatically. The more he explained, the more relaxed I became. I realized I did not need to understand everyone perfectly. I simply needed to stay curious. Curiosity, according to many psychologists, is one of the most effective tools for learning and adaptation. Curious people ask questions instead of making assumptions. They learn faster because they remain open to new experiences. Without realizing it, Robert was teaching me that curiosity could be more valuable than confidence. A few days later, another lesson arrived unexpectedly. I was telling Robert about an embarrassing mistake I had made while speaking English at work. I expected him to laugh. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "Good," he said. "That means you're learning." I stared at him. "Good." It was embarrassing. He chuckled. "You know what's worse than making mistakes?" I shook my head. "Never trying because you're afraid of making them." Those words stayed with me. Many language learners experience something called communication anxiety. Research has shown that fear of mistakes can reduce participation and slow language development. In other words, the very thing we fear often becomes the thing holding us back. Robert seemed to understand this instinctively. He often told me stories about his own failures. Some were funny. Some were painful. All of them carried the same message. Progress requires imperfection. The funny thing was that the more mistakes I made, the more comfortable I became speaking English. One afternoon at a grocery store, I accidentally used the wrong word while talking to a cashier. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I laughed. The cashier laughed too. The conversation continued. The world did not end. It sounds like a small victory, but those small victories slowly changed how I saw myself. Then came one of the most surprising lessons of all. It happened during a neighborhood barbecue. Robert encouraged me to attend even though I was nervous. "You'll meet good people," he said. "And you'll practice your English." The idea terrified me. Dozens of strangers. Endless conversations. Opportunities to make mistakes. Every excuse in my mind suddenly appeared. Yet Robert remained persistent. Eventually, I agreed. That evening became one of the most important experiences of my first year in America. Families gathered around picnic tables. Children played games on the grass. Music drifted through the air. The smell of grilled food filled the neighborhood. At first, I stood quietly near the edge of the crowd. Old habits are difficult to break. Then something unexpected happened. People approached me. They asked where I was from. They asked about my experiences. They listened with genuine interest. Nobody expected perfect English. Nobody judged my accent. Nobody seemed concerned about the occasional mistake. In fact, many people shared stories about their own families immigrating to America generations earlier. For the first time, I realized something powerful. Connection matters more than perfection. Most people are not listening for mistakes. They are listening for meaning. Communication is not about sounding flawless. It is about building understanding. That realization reduced a huge amount of pressure. Over the following months, my confidence continued growing. I started greeting neighbors first instead of waiting for them to greet me. I joined community events. I participated in conversations that I would have avoided before. Yet the biggest lesson was still waiting for me. One evening, while we watched the sunset from his porch, I asked Robert a question. "How do you always know what to say?" He laughed so hard that coffee nearly spilled from his cup. "Trust me," he said. "I don't." Then his expression became thoughtful. "I just listen." He pointed toward the street. Most people spend their lives waiting for their turn to talk. Very few spend time learning how to listen. Modern communication research supports this idea. Active listening strengthens relationships, increases trust, and improves understanding. Yet in a world full of distractions, genuine listening has become surprisingly rare. Robert practiced it naturally. He remembered details from previous conversations. He asked thoughtful questions. He paid attention. Because of that, people felt comfortable around him. I started trying the same approach. The results were remarkable. Conversations became easier. Friendships formed more naturally. Even my English improved because listening carefully helped me understand language patterns more effectively. It felt as if a hidden door had opened. Still, one mystery continued bothering me. Robert seemed unusually wise about loneliness, fear, and personal growth. His advice felt too specific to come from theory alone. It felt lived. Earned. One evening, as the sky darkened and the neighborhood lights began glowing in the distance, I finally decided to ask the question that had been sitting in my mind for weeks. "Robert," I said, "how did you learn all these lessons?" For the first time since I had known him, he became completely silent. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon. The smile disappeared from his face. A long moment passed before he finally spoke. "Because I learned them the hard way." His voice sounded different. Heavier. Older. More fragile. Then he looked directly at me and said something I never expected to hear. "Believe it or not, there was a time when I was even more lost than you are now." In that moment, I realized that the friendly neighbor I admired had been hiding a remarkable story. A story filled with struggles, heartbreak, and choices that would eventually shape everything he became. And as he prepared to reveal the truth about his past, I had no idea that his story would soon change the direction of my own life forever. A difficult winter. If you have ever believed that progress moves in a straight line, life eventually teaches you a different lesson. Sometimes just when things seem to be improving, a storm arrives. Not the kind of storm you see on weather maps. The kind that settles inside your mind. The kind that quietly tests everything you thought you had learned. That storm arrived during my first winter in America. Until then, life had been slowly getting better. My English was improving. My confidence was growing. My friendship with Robert had become one of the brightest parts of my week. For the first time since arriving in the United States, I felt like I might actually belong here. Then the seasons changed. At first, the transformation looked beautiful. Leaves turned gold, orange, and red. The neighborhood resembled a postcard. Cool air replaced the warmth of summer. Families decorated their homes for the holidays. Everywhere I looked, people seemed excited. I tried to feel the same excitement. But beneath the beauty, new challenges were quietly approaching. One morning I woke up and looked outside. Snow covered everything. The trees, rooftops, sidewalks, and streets had disappeared beneath a blanket of white. It was my first real American winter. At first, it felt magical. I took pictures. I walked through the snow. I admired the peaceful silence. A few days later, the magic began fading. Driving became more difficult. Heating bills increased. The cold seemed to find its way into every corner of life. The sun disappeared earlier each evening. Darkness arrived before dinner. Many scientists have studied how reduced sunlight can affect mood and energy levels. Seasonal changes can influence sleep patterns, motivation, and emotional well-being. At the time, I did not know the science behind it. I only knew that I felt tired more often. Some mornings, getting out of bed felt surprisingly difficult. Work became more stressful as expenses increased. Unexpected bills arrived. Small financial problems started piling up. Individually, each challenge seemed manageable. Together, they felt overwhelming. One evening I sat at my kitchen table staring at a stack of bills. Outside, snow fell steadily beneath the glow of streetlights. Inside, my thoughts were becoming darker. What if I failed? What if I ran out of money? What if I had made a mistake moving to America? Fear loves asking questions. Unfortunately, it rarely provides helpful answers. The human brain has a natural tendency called negativity bias. Researchers have found that people often focus more heavily on threats and problems than positive developments. This bias helped our ancestors survive dangerous environments. In modern life, however, it can make temporary setbacks feel permanent. My brain seemed determined to focus on everything going wrong. The friendships I had built felt insignificant compared to financial stress. My progress in English suddenly seemed inadequate. I declined invitations. I spent more time alone. The habits I thought I had overcome quietly returned. Robert noticed immediately. One afternoon he knocked on my door. "You haven't been yourself lately," he said. I smiled and insisted everything was fine. He looked unconvinced. "Want to go for a walk?" he asked. The idea sounded ridiculous. Snow covered the ground. Cold wind moved through the neighborhood. I wanted to stay inside. Yet something in his expression reminded me of all the times he had helped me before. So I agreed. We walked slowly through the snowy streets. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Eventually Robert broke the silence. "Winter can play tricks on people." I laughed softly. "You mean the weather?" "Not just the weather," he replied. "The mind." He explained that difficult seasons often make people forget how far they have already come. When challenges appear, the brain focuses on immediate discomfort rather than long-term progress. His words sounded simple, yet they described exactly what I was experiencing. We continued walking. Snow crunched beneath our boots. The cold air stung my face. Finally, I admitted the truth. I told him about the financial pressure, the loneliness, the fear, the growing doubt. Robert listened quietly. When I finished, he nodded. "Good." I stared at him. "Good?" "Yes," he said. "Because now we're talking about the real problem." That answer surprised me. He explained that many people spend enormous amounts of energy pretending everything is fine. As a result, they never address what is actually hurting them. Honest conversations create opportunities for solutions. Silence usually creates more anxiety. Modern psychology strongly supports this idea. Studies show that expressing emotions can reduce stress and improve problem-solving abilities. Once again, Robert seemed to understand important principles without needing scientific vocabulary. Then he said something I never forgot. A difficult season is not the same thing as a difficult life. We stopped near a frozen pond. The surface looked lifeless beneath the snow. Robert pointed toward it. "What do you see?" "Ice," I answered. He smiled. "Exactly. Most people see winter and assume growth has stopped. But beneath the surface, life is still there. Trees are still alive. Seeds are still waiting. Spring is still coming." His words stayed with me long after our walk ended. Over the following weeks, I tried focusing on small actions instead of overwhelming fears. I continued practicing English. I maintained my routines. I accepted invitations instead of isolating myself. Progress remained slow, but it continued. Then something unexpected happened. One evening, while helping Robert shovel snow from his driveway, I noticed an old photograph hanging inside his garage. The picture showed a much younger version of him standing beside a woman and 2 children. They looked happy. Yet I had never seen those people before. Robert lived alone. Curious, I asked who they were. For a brief moment, a shadow crossed his face. The cheerful expression I knew so well disappeared. He looked at the photograph for several seconds before answering. "That's my family." His voice sounded distant. Almost fragile. I waited quietly. Something told me there was more to the story. Much more. Finally, he closed the garage door and turned toward me. "You know," he said softly, "there was a winter many years ago when I lost almost everything." The cold wind suddenly felt irrelevant. The snow no longer mattered. For the first time, I realized that the man who had spent months helping me survive my struggles might have survived challenges far greater than my own. And as Robert prepared to share the painful chapter that shaped his life forever, I had a feeling that the story behind his smile was about to reveal a truth neither of us could escape. The story behind his smile. There are moments in life when a person says a single sentence and suddenly everything you thought you knew about them changes. That evening, standing inside Robert's garage while snow drifted quietly outside, I realized I knew very little about the man who had become one of the most important people in my life. For months, I had seen his kindness, his patience, and his steady optimism. I had assumed he was simply one of those rare people who naturally viewed the world positively. But as he looked at the old family photograph hanging on the wall, I saw something different in his eyes. Not sadness exactly. Something deeper. The kind of emotion that only appears when a person is remembering a chapter of life they never fully leave behind. Robert remained silent for several seconds before speaking. "You know," he said quietly, "people often think happy people have easy lives." He smiled faintly. "Usually the opposite is true." We moved inside his house, away from the cold. The familiar warmth of his living room felt different that evening. The room was filled with books, family photographs, and memories. Yet now I found myself wondering how many stories were hidden behind those pictures. Robert sat down in an old chair near the window. For a moment, he stared at the falling snow. Then he began telling me about his past. Decades earlier, he had been a very different person. Young. Ambitious. Impatient. He had married his high school sweetheart, a woman named Emily. According to Robert, She had a laugh that could brighten an entire room. They built a life together in the same town where we now lived. They bought a house, raised 2 children, worked hard. Like many families, they believed the future would unfold according to their plans. Life, however, rarely asks for permission before changing direction. One evening, years ago, everything shifted. Robert's company suddenly closed. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. What began as a financial setback gradually became something larger. Stress entered the household. Anxiety followed. The future that once felt secure suddenly became uncertain. Listening to him, I noticed similarities between his experience and my own fears. Research in psychology consistently shows that financial uncertainty is one of the strongest sources of stress for adults. It affects relationships, sleep, decision-making, and emotional well-being. Robert had experienced all of it. I thought my job was my identity, he admitted. When I lost it, I felt like I lost myself. That sentence struck me deeply. Many people unknowingly attach their self-worth to external circumstances. Careers, income, status, achievements. When those things disappear, they begin questioning their value as human beings. Robert explained that this was exactly what happened to him. Months passed without finding stable work. Confidence disappeared. Frustration grew. Eventually he became withdrawn. He stopped talking openly with friends. He stopped sharing his worries with his family. He convinced himself that carrying every burden alone was a sign of strength. It wasn't. The funny thing about isolation, he said, is that it feels like protection at first. Then it becomes a prison. Modern mental health experts often describe loneliness in similar terms. Human beings are social creatures. Connection supports resilience. Isolation weakens it. The more Robert withdrew, the harder life became. Yet that was not the hardest part of his story. He glanced toward the family photograph again. His voice softened. A few years after losing his job, Emily became seriously ill. At first, doctors believed treatment would solve the problem. The family remained hopeful. Then the diagnosis changed. The illness was more severe than anyone expected. The room grew quiet as he spoke. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the window. Inside, I found myself listening more carefully than ever before. Robert described long hospital visits, difficult conversations, and months filled with uncertainty. Through it all, Emily remained remarkably positive. Even during her hardest days, she focused on encouraging others. She spent more time comforting me than I spent comforting her, he said with a sad smile. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only gratitude. Then came the moment I had been unconsciously expecting yet still dreaded hearing. Emily passed away. The sentence arrived softly. No dramatic pause. No theatrical emotion. Just a simple truth that still carried enormous weight decades later. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. I understood now why Robert seemed to understand loneliness so deeply. He had lived through it. He had faced fears far greater than the ones currently troubling me. Yet what happened next surprised me even more. I expected his story to become darker. Instead, it became hopeful. For a long time, I was angry, Robert admitted. Angry at life. Angry at circumstances. Angry at things I couldn't control. That reaction is common. Psychologists often explain that grief and loss can trigger powerful emotional responses. Anger frequently becomes a way of processing pain. But eventually something unexpected happened. A neighbor knocked on his door. Then another. Friends invited him to community events. People checked on him. They listened. They cared. One small act of kindness at a time, they helped him rebuild his life. Suddenly everything clicked. The reason Robert had welcomed me into his life was standing right in front of me. Years earlier, others had done the same for him. The kindness he showed today was an extension of kindness he once received. Nobody survives difficult seasons completely alone, he said. At least, nobody should have to. Those words stayed with me. Studies on resilience consistently show that social support is one of the strongest predictors of recovery during challenging times. Human connection does not eliminate pain, but it helps people carry it. Robert's life was proof of that principle. Then he shared something that surprised me even more. After Emily died, I almost moved away. I stared at him. That seemed impossible. Robert felt woven into the fabric of the neighborhood itself. Yet he explained that grief had convinced him to leave. Every street reminded him of memories. Every corner carried emotional weight. Then one day an older neighbor stopped him before he made the decision. The man offered a simple piece of advice. Stay long enough to see what life does next. Robert followed that advice. Years later, he still considered it one of the best decisions he had ever made. As he finished speaking, the room felt different. Not heavier. More meaningful. I finally understood why Robert smiled so easily. His optimism was not the result of an easy life. It was the result of surviving a difficult one. He appreciated ordinary moments because he understood how precious they were. Yet just when I thought his story was finished, he surprised me once more. He stood up, walked toward a bookshelf, and removed an old photo album. After flipping through several pages, he stopped at a photograph and handed it to me. The image showed a much younger version of Robert standing beside a woman I had never seen before. She was smiling brightly, and they appeared unusually close. "Who's that?" I asked. Robert stared at the photograph and smiled. This time the smile carried mystery. "That's the person who changed my future," he said. "And the reason I know your story is only beginning." In that moment, curiosity rushed through me. I had assumed Emily was the central chapter of his life. Yet it was suddenly clear there was another story hidden beneath the surface. One that would eventually connect to my own journey in ways I could not yet imagine. An unexpected friendship. Some friendships arrive with great excitement. Others arrive so quietly that you do not realize how important they have become until one day you imagine life without them. That was exactly what happened with Robert. By the time spring arrived and the snow finally disappeared from our neighborhood, our daily conversations had become part of my routine. What began as simple greetings had evolved into something much deeper. Looking back, it is difficult to identify the exact moment when Robert stopped being just my neighbor and became one of my closest friends. Perhaps it happened during those long afternoons on his porch. Perhaps it happened during the winter when he helped me face my fears. Or perhaps friendship grows the same way trees grow, so gradually that you only notice the change after enough time has passed. The photograph Robert had shown me the previous evening remained in my thoughts for days. The mysterious woman in the picture seemed connected to an important chapter of his life, yet he had revealed very little. Every time I considered asking more questions, I hesitated. I sensed he would share the story when he was ready. Meanwhile, our friendship continued growing. One Saturday morning, Robert invited me to join him at a small cafe downtown. The place was one of those charming local businesses that seemed untouched by time. The owner greeted customers by name. Old photographs covered the walls. Fresh coffee filled the air. It felt like the kind of place where stories naturally belonged. As we sat near the window, Robert observed people moving along the sidewalk outside. Then he smiled and said something unexpected. "You know, 6 months ago, you would have never agreed to come here." I laughed because he was right. 6 months earlier, the idea of sitting in a crowded cafe, speaking English, and interacting with strangers would have filled me with anxiety. Yet now it felt normal. That observation revealed something important. Personal growth often becomes invisible while it is happening. Researchers who study habit formation and behavioral change frequently note that people underestimate gradual progress because daily improvements seem too small to notice. Yet over time, those tiny changes create remarkable transformations. Robert had noticed changes in me that I had overlooked myself. "You're different now," he said. "More confident." "Not always," I admitted. He nodded. "Nobody feels confident all the time." That answer sounded simple, yet it challenged one of my biggest misconceptions. I had spent years believing confident people rarely experienced doubt. The truth was far more interesting. Confidence was not the absence of uncertainty. Confidence was learning to move forward despite uncertainty. Over the following weeks, our conversations became increasingly personal. Robert shared stories about his children, who now lived in different states. He talked about mistakes he had made when he was younger. He spoke openly about regrets and lessons learned. In return, I found myself sharing details about my own hopes, fears, and dreams. There is something powerful about being truly heard. Studies in psychology suggest that meaningful social connections improve emotional well-being, reduce stress, and increase resilience. While researchers use complex terminology to describe these effects, the experience itself feels simple. You feel less alone. You feel understood. You feel stronger. One afternoon, while helping Robert plant flowers in his yard, I asked him whether he had always been good at making friends. He laughed so hard that he nearly dropped a gardening tool. "Absolutely not," he replied. According to Robert, he had been shy when he was younger. Very shy. The irony surprised me. The man who seemed capable of talking comfortably with anyone had once struggled socially himself. "Most people assume social skills are something you're born with," he explained. "They're not. They're something you practice." Modern research supports this idea. Communication skills, like any other skill, improve through repetition and experience. The more opportunities people have to interact with others, the more comfortable those interactions become. Listening to Robert reminded me of my journey with English. Every conversation that once felt frightening had gradually become easier through practice. Then came a day that changed our friendship forever. It started like any other afternoon. We were sitting on his porch discussing books when a delivery truck stopped in front of his house. The driver handed Robert a small package. As soon as Robert saw the return address, his expression changed. He became unusually quiet. Curious, I asked if everything was okay. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "It's from an old friend." Later that evening, he invited me inside. The package remained unopened on the table between us. For several minutes, neither of us touched it. Finally, Robert opened the box. Inside was an old journal, several photographs, and a handwritten letter. The moment he saw the letter, emotion appeared in his eyes. Not dramatic emotion. The kind people struggle to hide. He carefully unfolded the paper and began reading silently. When he finished, he sat quietly for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "Remember that photograph I showed you?" he asked. Of course I remembered. The mysterious woman had occupied my thoughts more than once. Robert smiled. Her name was Sarah. He paused before continuing. And without Sarah, I never would have survived the hardest period of my life. Suddenly, my curiosity returned stronger than ever. Until now, I had assumed Emily was the central love story in Robert's life. Yet it was becoming increasingly clear that Sarah represented something different. Something equally important. Perhaps even more transformative. Robert explained that Sarah entered his life years after Emily's passing. At a time when grief had convinced him that happiness belonged to other people. At a time when he believed his most meaningful chapters were already behind him. As he described those years, I noticed parallels to my own situation. Many people believe new opportunities disappear with age, disappointment, or failure. Yet life often surprises us precisely when we stop expecting it. Researchers studying resilience frequently observe that hope can return through unexpected relationships and experiences. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to rebuild after loss. Sarah, it seemed, had become part of that rebuilding process for Robert. He looked down at the old journal and smiled softly. The funny thing is, he said, meeting Sarah happened because of a conversation I almost avoided. Those words immediately captured my attention. After everything Robert had taught me about courage, communication, and connection, I sensed that this story would contain one of the most important lessons yet. More importantly, I had a growing feeling that his experience was preparing me for something in my own future. Something I could not yet see. Something that would soon arrive when I least expected it. And as the evening sunlight faded beyond the window, Robert began telling me the story of the conversation that changed his life forever, a story that would ultimately inspire me to take a risk that would lead me toward the greatest love of my own life. Meeting the woman I loved. There is a moment in many people's lives when they look back and realize that everything changed because they said yes to something they almost avoided. A conversation. An invitation. A phone call. A simple decision that seemed insignificant at the time. For me, that moment arrived on a warm Saturday afternoon, and strangely enough, it began with advice from Robert. A few days after he finished telling me about Sarah and the conversation that had changed his life. We were sitting on his porch watching the neighborhood settle into another peaceful evening. The sun was slowly disappearing behind the trees. Children were riding bicycles. Neighbors were chatting in their driveways. It felt like one of those ordinary moments that quietly become unforgettable. Robert took a sip of coffee and looked at me with a smile I had learned to recognize. It was the smile he wore whenever he was about to say something important. You know, he said, you've spent a lot of time building a life here. I nodded. You're working hard. Your English is improving. You're making friends. He paused. But you're still hiding. The comment caught me by surprise. I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain how much progress I had made. Yet deep down, I knew he was right. Although my confidence had improved, I still avoided certain risks. I stayed inside familiar routines. I rarely put myself in situations where rejection or failure felt possible. Robert leaned back in his chair. Life gets interesting when you stop waiting to feel ready. That sentence stayed with me long after I returned home. Psychologists often discuss something called the comfort zone. While comfort feels safe, growth usually happens beyond its boundaries. People frequently wait until they feel completely prepared before taking action. The problem is that confidence often comes after action, not before it. A few weeks later, an opportunity appeared. One of my coworkers invited me to a local community event held at a park near downtown. Food vendors, live music, local artists, and hundreds of people from across the area would attend. My first instinct was to decline. Crowded social events still made me nervous. The thought of spending hours speaking English with strangers felt exhausting. Yet Robert's words echoed in my mind. Life gets interesting when you stop waiting to feel ready. Against my usual instincts, I accepted the invitation. On the day of the event, I almost changed my mind 3 different times. Driving there, I rehearsed possible conversations in my head. What if I sounded awkward? What if I could not understand someone? What if I spent the entire afternoon feeling uncomfortable? These thoughts are surprisingly common. Research shows that social anxiety often causes people to overestimate negative outcomes while underestimating their ability to handle them. In reality, most situations are far less threatening than our minds predict. I parked my car and walked toward the event. Music filled the air. Families explored vendor booths. Friends laughed together beneath colorful tents. The atmosphere felt energetic and welcoming. Still, I remained nervous. For the first hour, I mostly observed. Then something unexpected happened. While standing near a local bookstore display, I reached for a novel at the exact same moment as someone else. Our hands nearly touched. We both laughed and stepped back. "You can take it," she said. Her voice was warm and calm. I looked up and saw a woman with bright eyes and an easy smile. There was something immediately comfortable about her presence. "No, it's okay," I replied. "You saw it first." She laughed again. "I think we found it at exactly the same time." The conversation should have ended there. Yet it didn't. We started talking about books. Then favorite authors. Then travel. Then life in general. Minutes passed so quickly that I barely noticed. Her name was Emma. She had grown up in a nearby town and worked as a teacher. Unlike many conversations I had worried about in the past, this one felt natural. There were pauses, mistakes, and moments when I searched for words, but none of it seemed to matter. Emma listened patiently. She smiled often. Most importantly, she made me feel comfortable being myself. Researchers studying attraction frequently note that emotional comfort plays a major role in forming meaningful connections. People are naturally drawn toward those who make them feel accepted and understood. Standing there among hundreds of strangers, I felt something I had not experienced in a very long time. Ease. The afternoon disappeared quickly. We walked through the event together, exploring booths and sharing stories. At one point, I told her about moving to America and struggling with English during my first months. Instead of judging me, she seemed genuinely interested. That must have taken courage, she said. Nobody had ever described my experience that way. I had focused so much on my fears that I rarely acknowledged the courage required to face them. As the event ended, a familiar problem appeared. I wanted to see her again. Unfortunately, wanting and acting are not always the same thing. Fear immediately returned. What if she was just being friendly? What if I misunderstood the connection? What if asking for her number made things awkward? Human beings have an incredible ability to create complicated worries from simple situations. Studies on social behavior show that fear of rejection often prevents people from pursuing meaningful opportunities. The irony is that avoiding rejection guarantees a different kind of loss. Lost possibilities. Lost experiences. Lost relationships. As Emma prepared to leave, I heard Robert's voice inside my head. Life gets interesting when you stop waiting to feel ready. Before I could overthink the situation, I took a deep breath. Would you like to get coffee sometime? The question felt enormous in the moment. Emma smiled. Not a polite smile. A genuine one. I'd like that. Those 3 words changed everything. We exchanged phone numbers and said goodbye. As I walked back toward my car, I felt strangely light. Nothing dramatic had happened. We had not declared our love. We had not planned a future together. Yet something important had begun. That evening, I stopped by Robert's house. The moment he opened the door, he looked at my face and laughed. Well, he said, something interesting happened today. I was amazed. How do you know? He grinned. Because that's the happiest you've looked in months. I told him the entire story. Every detail. Every nervous thought. Every moment of the conversation. When I finished, Robert smiled knowingly. Sometimes life rewards courage faster than we expect. Then he added something that made my curiosity grow once again. The first conversation is the easy part. I laughed. What's the difficult part? His smile widened. Learning whether 2 people can build a future together. At the time, I thought he was joking. I had no idea that the woman I met beside a bookstore display would soon become the most important relationship of my life. Nor did I realize that our journey would face challenges neither of us could yet imagine. But one thing was already certain. The conversation I almost avoided had become the beginning of a love story that was only just starting to unfold. Love across differences. Most love stories begin with attraction, but lasting relationships are built on something much more complicated. They are built on patience, understanding, communication, and the willingness to cross invisible bridges between 2 different worlds. When I first met Emma, I believed the hardest part had already happened. I had overcome my fear, started a conversation, and asked her out. Looking back now, that was the easy part. The real journey began after the excitement of those first few dates faded and reality slowly introduced itself. At first, everything felt effortless. We met for coffee. Then dinner. Then long walks through local parks where conversations seemed to flow naturally for hours. Every time we spent time together, I discovered something new about her. She was intelligent without being arrogant. Kind without expecting recognition. Funny in a quiet way that made ordinary moments memorable. Most importantly, she had a way of making people feel comfortable. Yet as our relationship grew stronger, our differences became more visible. Some differences were obvious. We came from different cultural backgrounds. We had grown up with different traditions, different expectations, and different experiences. Other differences were more subtle. The way we handled conflict. The way we expressed emotions. The way we viewed family responsibilities. These differences were not problems by themselves, but they required understanding. Modern relationship research consistently shows that successful couples are not people who avoid differences. They are people who learn how to navigate them respectfully. At the time, however, I had little experience with that process. One evening, during a conversation about holiday traditions, we encountered our first real misunderstanding. Emma described family gatherings she had attended every year since childhood. Large meals. Familiar rituals. Stories shared around crowded tables. I listened with interest and then explained traditions from my own background. Somewhere during the conversation, a simple misunderstanding occurred. Neither of us intended to offend the other. Yet both of us felt slightly hurt. The discussion became awkward. The atmosphere changed. For a moment, I worried that we had discovered an incompatibility. Fortunately, Emma handled the situation differently than I expected. Instead of becoming defensive, she asked questions. She wanted to understand why I viewed the situation differently. Her curiosity transformed what could have become an argument into a learning experience. That evening taught me one of the most valuable lessons about relationships. Understanding is often more important than agreement. Two people do not need identical opinions to build a strong connection. They need respect. They need empathy. They need the willingness to listen. Interestingly, communication researchers have reached similar conclusions. Strong relationships depend less on avoiding disagreements and more on how disagreements are handled. Respectful communication creates trust. Defensiveness weakens it. As weeks turned into months, Emma and I continued learning about each other's worlds. She introduced me to aspects of American culture I had never fully experienced. Small-town festivals. Family traditions. Community events. In return, I shared stories, customs, and values from my own background. Rather than competing, our cultures began enriching one another. Robert watched this process with quiet amusement. Every time I shared a story about Emma, he smiled knowingly. One afternoon, while we sat on his porch, he asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you know what love really is?" I laughed. "That's a big question." He nodded. "Exactly." After a moment, he gave his answer. "Love is choosing curiosity over assumptions." At first, the statement sounded unusual. Then the more I considered it, the more it made sense. Assumptions create distance. Curiosity creates connection. Whenever Emma and I encountered differences, curiosity helped us move forward. Another challenge appeared several months later. Emma's family invited me to a large gathering. The invitation seemed simple enough, but I immediately felt nervous. Meeting a partner's family can be intimidating under any circumstances. Doing it while still gaining confidence in a second language felt even more daunting. Once again, fear tried to convince me to avoid discomfort. Once again, I remembered Robert's advice. Growth lives beyond familiar boundaries. The gathering took place at her parents' home. As I arrived, dozens of relatives filled the house and backyard. Conversations happened everywhere. Laughter echoed from room to room. The scene looked overwhelming. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of treating me like an outsider, Emma's family welcomed me warmly. They asked questions. They shared stories. They genuinely wanted to know me. That experience changed how I viewed belonging. Many people assume acceptance requires perfection. In reality, authenticity often matters far more. People connect with sincerity, not flawless performance. During dinner, Emma's father asked about my journey to America. For several minutes, I spoke openly about my struggles, fears, and hopes. Nobody interrupted. Nobody judged. They simply listened. When I finished, her father smiled and said, "You've come a long way." Those words reminded me of something Robert had told me months earlier. Progress becomes difficult to see when you live inside it every day. Sometimes others recognize our growth before we do. As the relationship deepened, Emma and I began discussing the future. Not dramatic plans. Small possibilities. Shared goals. Dreams. The conversations felt exciting, but they also carried responsibility. Commitment requires courage. Vulnerability requires trust. Building a future with another person means accepting uncertainty together. Researchers studying long-term relationships often emphasize the importance of shared vision. Couples who align around common values and goals tend to navigate challenges more successfully. Fortunately, despite our differences, Emma and I discovered remarkable alignment in the areas that mattered most. Family. Kindness. Growth. Integrity. These foundations strengthened our connection. Yet not everything was easy. There were moments of frustration. Misunderstandings. Stressful days when communication felt harder than usual. Real relationships are not fairy tales. They involve two imperfect people learning together. The difference was that we kept choosing the relationship even when things became difficult. One evening, after spending the day with Emma, I stopped by Robert's house. We sat quietly on the porch as the sun disappeared beyond the neighborhood. After a few minutes, he looked at me and smiled. "You're in love." The statement felt embarrassingly accurate. I laughed. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to everyone." Then his expression became thoughtful. "The question isn't whether you love her." I looked at him curiously. "What's the question?" He stared toward the fading horizon before answering. "The question is whether you're ready for what comes next." At the time, I assumed he was talking about commitment. About building a future together. I had no idea that life was already preparing a new chapter. A chapter filled with bigger responsibilities, greater challenges, and decisions that would test everything Emma and I had learned about love. And as summer slowly turned toward autumn, one unexpected conversation would soon push our relationship toward a future neither of us had fully imagined. Marriage and new challenges. Many people imagine that marriage is the finish line of a love story. Movies often end with weddings. Music swells. Smiles fill the screen. The credits roll. Real life, however, begins after that moment. The wedding is not the conclusion of the story. It is the beginning of a new chapter filled with responsibilities, unexpected challenges, and opportunities to grow together. Looking back, I can honestly say that marrying Emma was one of the happiest decisions of my life. I can also say it was one of the most challenging. Not because we stopped loving each other. Quite the opposite. We loved each other deeply. The challenge came from learning how to build a shared life in the real world. Several months after our engagement, we stood together surrounded by family and friends as we exchanged vows. It was a beautiful day. The weather was perfect. Laughter filled the air. Even Robert seemed more emotional than usual. As I looked around during the ceremony, I realized how much my life had changed. A few years earlier, I had arrived in America feeling isolated and uncertain. Now I stood beside the woman I loved, surrounded by people who felt like family. Yet life has a remarkable habit of introducing new lessons immediately after major milestones. Shortly after the wedding, reality arrived carrying bills, schedules, responsibilities, and countless decisions. Where would we live? How would we manage finances? What goals should we prioritize? Which sacrifices were necessary? These questions may not sound romantic, but they play a significant role in long-term relationships. Relationship researchers frequently emphasize that successful marriages depend on more than emotional connection. Communication, cooperation, and shared problem-solving are equally important. Emma and I quickly discovered that love alone does not automatically solve practical challenges. One of our first major adjustments involved finances. We both worked hard, but combining two lives required new habits and new decisions. Some months felt comfortable. Others felt stressful. Unexpected expenses appeared. Plans changed. Goals had to be adjusted. During those moments, I often remembered the difficult winter Robert had helped me survive years earlier. Fear still tried to create worst-case scenarios. Fortunately, experience had taught me something valuable. Temporary challenges are not permanent realities. Another challenge involved time. Before marriage, most of our time together had been intentional. Dates. Weekend activities. Shared experiences. After marriage, daily life became more complex. Work schedules competed with household responsibilities. Fatigue sometimes replaced excitement. Researchers studying relationships often describe this transition. The shift from romance to partnership requires adaptation. Successful couples learn how to protect connection while managing responsibilities. Emma seemed to understand this instinctively. Even during busy weeks, she found small ways to strengthen our relationship. Shared meals. Evening walks. Simple conversations before bed. Those moments appeared ordinary, yet they created stability. Gradually, I learned an important lesson. Relationships are not built only through major events. They are built through repeated small actions. Consistency often matters more than intensity. Meanwhile, Robert remained an important presence in our lives. He often invited us to dinner. Sometimes he shared stories from his own marriage. Other times he simply listened. One evening, after hearing us discuss a disagreement about household responsibilities, he laughed and said something memorable. "Congratulations. You're officially married." Emma and I both laughed. Then Robert became serious. The goal isn't avoiding disagreements. The goal is learning how to solve them together. Modern marriage research strongly supports this perspective. Conflict itself is not necessarily harmful. The way couples handle conflict matters far more. Respectful communication strengthens relationships. Contempt and defensiveness weaken them. Fortunately, Emma and I were learning. Not perfectly. Not instantly. But steadily. Then another challenge appeared. My career entered a period of uncertainty. Changes at work created stress and raised difficult questions about the future. For a while, old insecurities returned. I worried about providing for our future. I worried about making the right decisions. I worried about disappointing the people I loved. Anxiety often creates the illusion that carrying burdens alone is noble. Yet experience had already taught me otherwise. Instead of withdrawing, I spoke openly with Emma. We discussed options, shared concerns, made plans together. That choice made a tremendous difference. Studies consistently show that emotional support improves resilience during stressful periods. Facing problems together often feels easier than facing them alone. Through every challenge, Emma remained remarkably steady. She reminded me of something Robert had once said. Difficult seasons are not the same thing as difficult lives. The phrase became one of our guiding principles. Whenever setbacks appeared, we focused on solutions instead of catastrophes. Slowly, the uncertainty passed. New opportunities emerged. Life moved forward once again. Then came a conversation that changed everything. It happened on an ordinary evening. Emma and I were sitting in the living room discussing future plans. We talked about careers, travel, goals, dreams. Eventually the topic shifted toward family. Neither of us had planned the conversation. Yet suddenly it became the center of our attention. For several minutes, we spoke honestly about hopes we had never fully expressed before. By the end of the discussion, something had become clear. We both wanted children. The realization felt exciting. It also felt intimidating. Becoming a parent represents one of life's greatest transitions. It changes priorities, routines, perspectives. Researchers often describe parenthood as both deeply rewarding and uniquely demanding. Listening to those descriptions was one thing. Imagining the reality was another. A few days later, we shared our thoughts with Robert. He listened quietly and smiled. Then he looked at us with the same expression he often wore before offering an important lesson. Children don't make life easier, he said. They make life bigger. The statement stayed with me. Bigger responsibilities. Bigger worries. Bigger joys. Bigger love. At the time, those ideas felt abstract. The future remained uncertain. Yet deep down, I sensed another chapter approaching. One far different from anything I had experienced before. Months later, that chapter would arrive sooner than expected. A single piece of news would transform our daily routines, reshape our priorities, and fill our home with a level of happiness neither of us had imagined possible. But along with that joy would come sleepless nights, difficult decisions, and lessons that no book could fully teach. And as Emma and I prepared to enter the next stage of our journey together, we had no idea how profoundly our lives were about to change. The day everything changed. There are certain days that divide life into two parts. The life you knew before and the life that begins afterward. Most of the time, you do not recognize those days while they are happening. They appear ordinary. The sun rises normally. People go to work. Traffic moves through the streets. Birds sing outside the window. Then a single moment arrives, and suddenly nothing feels quite the same again. For Emma and me, that moment arrived on a quiet Tuesday evening. Looking back now, I remember almost every detail. The smell of dinner cooking in the kitchen. The soft sound of music playing from another room. The golden light of sunset stretching across the living room floor. It seemed like a completely ordinary evening. Yet within a few minutes, our future would change forever. Emma walked into the room holding a small object in her hand. At first, I did not understand why she looked both excited and nervous. Then I noticed tears forming in her eyes. My heart immediately began racing. 1,000 possibilities flashed through my mind. Before I could ask a question, she smiled. We're going to be parents. For a few seconds, my brain completely stopped working. I simply stared at her. Then I looked at the small pregnancy test in her hand. Then back at her face. Then back at the test. It felt as though time had slowed down. Researchers often describe major life events as emotionally overwhelming because the brain struggles to process large amounts of information at once. In that moment, I understood exactly what they meant. Joy. Surprise. Excitement. Gratitude. Fear. Hope. Every emotion seemed to arrive simultaneously. Then reality finally reached me. We were going to have a child. I stood up, walked across the room, and hugged Emma tighter than I ever had before. Neither of us said much. We simply stood there smiling and laughing through tears. Sometimes words are too small for moments that big. That night, neither of us slept very well. Not because we were worried. Because our minds were racing with possibilities. We talked about names, dreams, future adventures, family traditions. We imagined birthday parties, school events, bedtime stories, and countless moments that had not even happened yet. Human beings are natural storytellers. We often begin imagining the future long before it arrives. Yet as exciting as those dreams felt, reality soon introduced itself. Over the following weeks, we learned something important. Becoming parents starts long before the baby arrives. Suddenly, every decision felt more meaningful. We paid greater attention to our finances. We discussed long-term goals. We talked about the kind of parents we hoped to become. Studies consistently show that major life transitions encourage people to reevaluate priorities. Parenthood is perhaps one of the strongest examples. The future no longer belonged only to us. Someone else would soon depend on our choices. One of the first people we told was Robert. I will never forget his reaction. We visited his house on a Saturday afternoon. Emma shared the news while we sat on the familiar porch where so many important conversations had taken place. For a moment, Robert simply stared at us. Then a huge smile spread across his face. Well, he said, your lives are officially about to become wonderfully complicated. We all laughed. Yet I noticed something emotional in his expression. A mixture of happiness and reflection. It was as though our news reminded him of memories from decades earlier. He told us stories about becoming a father for the first time. Stories about mistakes he had made. Stories about lessons he learned far too late. One piece of advice stood out above all the others. Your children won't remember every gift you buy, he said. They'll remember how you made them feel. Modern developmental psychology supports this idea. Emotional security plays a critical role in childhood development. Children thrive when they feel safe, valued, and loved. The advice sounded simple. Yet it carried tremendous wisdom. As the months passed, Emma's pregnancy progressed smoothly. We attended appointments. Read books. asked endless questions. Every milestone felt exciting. Hearing the baby's heartbeat for the first time was unforgettable. Seeing ultrasound images transformed an abstract idea into reality. Suddenly there was a tiny human being growing inside the person I loved most. The experience changed me in ways I did not expect. I became more patient, more thoughtful, more aware of time. Before, I often focused on immediate concerns, work deadlines, daily frustrations, small inconveniences. Now my perspective felt different. Researchers sometimes refer to this shift as future-oriented thinking. Significant life events encourage people to think beyond the present moment. Every decision seemed connected to a larger picture. Yet despite all the excitement, moments of fear still appeared. Late at night, questions occasionally entered my mind. Would I be a good father? Could I provide enough support? Would I make mistakes? The honest answer was yes. Of course I would make mistakes. Every parent does. Perfection was never the goal. Presence was. One evening, I shared these worries with Robert. His response immediately put me at ease. The fact that you're worried already tells me something important. I looked at him curiously. What? He smiled. You care. Then he added, good parents aren't people who know everything. They're people who keep learning. That answer stayed with me. It reflected one of the biggest lessons I had learned since arriving in America. Growth never truly ends. Whether learning a language, building a career, strengthening a marriage, or becoming a parent, the process remains the same. Stay curious. Stay humble. Keep learning. Eventually, the final weeks of pregnancy arrived. Excitement filled our home. The nursery was ready. Tiny clothes waited neatly folded in drawers. Family members checked in constantly. Everyone seemed eager for the baby's arrival. Yet nobody could predict exactly when the moment would come. Then, one rainy evening, Emma looked at me and smiled nervously. I think it's time. My heart nearly stopped. Suddenly everything became urgent. Hospital bags. Phone calls. Car keys. Directions. Adrenaline transformed ordinary tasks into an adventure. As we drove through the rain toward the hospital, I realized another chapter of life was ending. The chapter of anticipation. The chapter of preparation. Ahead of us waited something entirely new. Something beautiful. Something challenging. Something life-changing. Within a matter of hours, I would meet the person who would forever redefine the meaning of family, responsibility, and love. And as the hospital lights appeared in the distance, I had no idea that the next 24 hours would become some of the most unforgettable hours of my entire life. The greatest lesson. There are moments so powerful that they quietly rearrange your entire understanding of life. No speech can prepare you for them. No book can fully explain them. No amount of advice can replace experiencing them yourself. The day our child was born became one of those moments. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and remember the details. The bright hospital lights. The steady sounds of medical equipment. The nervous energy in the room. The mixture of excitement and fear that seemed to fill every second. As Emma and I arrived at the hospital that rainy evening, everything suddenly felt real. For months, parenthood had existed mostly in conversations, plans, and imagination. Now it was standing directly in front of us. The hours that followed felt strangely fast and incredibly slow at the same time. Anyone who has experienced a major life event may understand that feeling. Time seems to stretch and collapse simultaneously. 1 minute feels like an hour. An hour feels like a minute. Through it all, Emma demonstrated a strength that amazed me. I had always admired her intelligence, kindness, and patience. That night I discovered a new level of respect for her. Watching someone you love face difficulty with courage changes the way you see them forever. Researchers who study relationships often describe shared challenges as opportunities for deeper bonding. Difficult experiences can strengthen emotional connection when people face them together. Sitting beside Emma in that hospital room, I understood exactly what that meant. Every encouraging word. Every reassuring smile. Every small gesture carried meaning. Then came the moment that changed everything. A cry filled the room. A small, powerful sound unlike anything I had ever heard before. For a second, the entire world seemed to pause. Doctors moved. Nurses smiled. Emotions rushed through me faster than I could process them. Then I saw our child for the first time. People often say that life changes when you become a parent. The statement sounds simple until you experience it yourself. In one instant, priorities shift. Perspectives change. The future suddenly feels larger than your own ambitions. Holding my child for the first time felt almost impossible to describe. Joy. Gratitude. Wonder. Responsibility. Love. Every emotion seemed to exist at once. Scientists sometimes explain that powerful emotional experiences create especially vivid memories because the brain prioritizes significant events. Perhaps that is why I remember that moment so clearly. The tiny hands. The peaceful expression. The overwhelming realization that this little person would become one of the most important parts of my life. Emma and I looked at each other and smiled through tears. Neither of us needed many words. We both understood that a completely new chapter had begun. The first few weeks at home were beautiful and exhausting. Sometimes both at the same time. Before becoming a parent, I imagined sleepless nights would be the hardest part. In reality, sleep was only one challenge among many. Feeding schedules. Diaper changes. Unexpected worries. Constant adjustments. Life suddenly operated according to a different rhythm. Yet something interesting happened. The difficulties never felt meaningless. Every challenge carried purpose. Psychologists often discuss the difference between stressful experiences and meaningful experiences. Parenthood frequently combines both. The work is demanding, but the emotional rewards can be extraordinary. Some nights Emma and I felt exhausted beyond words. Then our child would smile, and somehow the difficult day seemed lighter. One afternoon, a few weeks after bringing the baby home, I stopped by Robert's house. It was the first time I had seen him since the birth. As soon as I walked onto the porch, he smiled. "You look tired," he said. I laughed. "That's because I am." He nodded knowingly. "Good." Once again, his answer surprised me. "Good?" I asked. He smiled. "That means you're doing the job." We sat together for a while. The familiar porch felt different now. Perhaps because I was different. Eventually, Robert asked a simple question. "So what have you learned?" I started listing practical things. How to function with less sleep. How to calm a crying baby. How quickly priorities can change. Robert listened patiently. Then he shook his head. No, he said softly. What have you really learned? The question stayed with me. For several moments, I searched for the right answer. Finally, I found it. I've learned that love grows. Robert smiled. Exactly. Before becoming a husband, I thought I understood love. Then marriage expanded that understanding. Before becoming a father, I thought I understood it even more. Then parenthood expanded it again. Love was not a fixed amount. It was something that continued growing when given space to grow. Modern research on family relationships often highlights the importance of emotional bonds in creating resilience and well-being. Yet sitting on that porch, the concept felt much simpler. Love changes people. It had changed me. Months passed. Our child grew stronger. Family routines developed. Life found a new balance. Not perfect balance, but real balance. The kind created through experience rather than planning. During that time, I noticed something else. My English continued improving almost without effort. Years earlier, learning English had felt like climbing a mountain. Now it felt like a natural part of life. Conversations happened daily. Reading felt easier. Confidence came more naturally. The irony made me smile. I had originally come to America hoping to improve my English. Along the way, I had gained far more than language skills. I had gained friendships, community, love, family, perspective. Most importantly, I had gained a deeper understanding of myself. One evening, while watching my child play in the living room, I thought about the person I had been when I first arrived in America. Lonely. Uncertain. Afraid of making mistakes. Afraid of speaking. Afraid of failure. That version of me felt very distant now. Not because life had become perfect. It certainly had not. Challenges still appeared. Problems still existed. The difference was that I no longer faced them alone. Then a thought occurred to me. None of this would have happened without a simple wave from a neighbor across the street. One smile. One greeting. One conversation. It seemed almost impossible. Yet life often changes through surprisingly small moments. As I reflected on that truth, I realized there was still one important conversation left to have with Robert. A conversation about gratitude, friendship, and the unexpected ways people shape each other's futures. And deep down, I knew that conversation would become the final piece of a journey that had started years earlier with a lonely newcomer standing at a window, wondering whether he would ever truly belong. The neighbor who changed my future. If someone had told me years ago that one of the most important people in my life would be a neighbor I barely noticed at first, I probably would have laughed. Life rarely introduces its greatest influences in dramatic ways. They do not always arrive with impressive titles, extraordinary achievements, or obvious significance. Sometimes they are simply standing across the street, watering flowers on a quiet morning, waiting for the right moment to say hello. As I watched my child grow and our family settle into a new rhythm, I found myself thinking more often about the journey that had brought me here. The journey had started with uncertainty. A new country. A new language. A new culture. Countless fears. Countless doubts. Yet somewhere along the way, those challenges had transformed into opportunities. The more I reflected on that transformation, the clearer one truth became. None of it would have happened exactly the same way without Robert. One autumn afternoon, several years after our first conversation, I walked across the street to visit him. The neighborhood looked much the same as it had on the day we met. Children played outside. Leaves drifted through the air. The familiar blue house stood quietly beneath the afternoon sun. Yet something felt different. Perhaps it was because I now understood how much history existed behind that front door. Robert was sitting on the porch when I arrived. As usual, he greeted me with a smile. Some things never changed. We spent the next hour talking about ordinary topics. Family. Community. Life. Then the conversation gradually became more reflective. Maybe we both sensed it was one of those rare moments when important things needed to be said. Eventually, I looked at him and asked a question I had never asked before. Do you realize how much you've changed my life? Robert immediately laughed. That's giving me way too much credit. But I shook my head. No. I'm serious. Then I started listing everything that had happened since the day we met. The confidence I gained speaking English. The friendships I built. The community I joined. The relationship with Emma. The family we created. The life that now felt possible. As I spoke, Robert listened quietly. For once, he had very little to say. When I finished, he looked toward the street for a long moment. Then he smiled. You know what's funny? He said. I was thinking the same thing about you. His answer surprised me. He explained that after losing Emily and experiencing years of loneliness, he had slowly rebuilt his life. Yet many of his later years had become predictable. Comfortable. Quiet. Then one day he noticed a young man standing alone by a window across the street. A young man who looked lost. A young man who reminded him of himself. You gave me something too, he said. A reminder that people still need each other. Those words stayed with me. Modern researchers who study happiness often reach a similar conclusion. Meaningful relationships consistently rank among the strongest predictors of long-term well-being. Achievements matter. Success matters. Financial security matters. But human connection remains one of the most powerful influences on happiness. Sitting on that porch, I realized that some of the greatest gifts people give each other are invisible. Encouragement. Kindness. Patience. Belief. A simple conversation at the right moment. The afternoon slowly turned into evening. Shadows stretched across the neighborhood. The same neighborhood that had once felt unfamiliar now felt like home. For a while, neither of us spoke. Most people spend years looking for big opportunities. He paused. But life often changes through small moments. The more I thought about it, the more accurate it seemed. A smile. A wave. A conversation. A decision to attend a community event. A choice to ask someone for coffee. Tiny actions. Massive consequences. Psychologists sometimes describe this as the cumulative effect of small decisions. Individual choices may appear insignificant. Over time, however, they shape entire lives. Looking back, nearly every major turning point in my journey began with something small. A greeting. A question. A risk. A moment of courage. The same pattern appeared again and again. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Robert. Gratitude for Emma. Gratitude for family. Gratitude for every challenge that had forced me to grow. Even the difficult moments now carried meaning. Without loneliness, I might never have appreciated connection. Without fear, I might never have discovered courage. Without uncertainty, I might never have recognized opportunity when it appeared. A few weeks later, our family invited Robert to dinner. Watching him sit at our table, laughing with Emma and playing with our child, felt strangely emotional. In many ways, he had become part of the family. Not through biology. Through friendship. Through kindness. Through years of showing up when it mattered. At one point during the evening, my child climbed onto Robert's lap and handed him a toy. The sight made me smile. It also reminded me of something important. Kindness travels farther than we imagine. A small act offered to one person often influences many others. Robert had helped me. I became a better husband, father, friend, and neighbor because of it. Those changes affected countless moments and relationships that followed. The ripple continued moving outward. Years later, when people ask me about my journey in America, they often expect dramatic stories. They expect major breakthroughs, huge opportunities, extraordinary events. Sometimes they seem disappointed when I tell them the truth. The truth is that my future changed because a neighbor smiled and waved. That is where the story really began. Not with success. Not with achievement. Not with luck. With kindness. And perhaps that is why this story matters. Because somewhere, right now, someone may feel lonely. Someone may feel discouraged. Someone may believe their situation will never improve. Yet the next chapter of their life could already be closer than they realize. It might arrive through a conversation. A friendship. A simple act of courage. A person they have not fully noticed yet. If there is one lesson I hope you remember from my story, it is this: never underestimate the power of small moments. They often become the chapters you remember forever. And sometimes, the person who changes your future is simply the neighbor next door. Before you leave this video, I want you to think about one question. What if the chapter you are struggling through right now is not the end of your story? What if the loneliness, the mistakes, the fear, the rejection, the slow progress, or the feeling that you are falling behind are actually leading you towards something you cannot see yet? A few years ago, I stood alone in a new country, afraid to speak, afraid to fail, and afraid that my future would never be better than my present. Today, I look around and see a life I once thought was impossible. Not because everything became easy. Not because I was lucky. But because I kept taking one small step after another. One conversation changed a friendship. One friendship changed my confidence. One decision changed my future. And one simple hello changed my entire life. Maybe your hello is still waiting for you. Maybe the person who will inspire you, help you, encourage you, or completely change your future is already closer than you think. Maybe tomorrow holds a chapter that today's version of you cannot even imagine. So don't give up on your story too early. The most beautiful pages are often written after the hardest chapters. And remember this. Your English does not need to be perfect to change your life. You do not need perfect confidence to start speaking. You do not need perfect timing to begin again. You only need the courage to take the next small step. If this story helped you relax, improve your English listening skills, or gave you hope today, please take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe for more slow English stories like this video to help more English learners find it. Share it with a friend who needs encouragement. Leave a comment and tell us what small moment changed your life. I read many of your comments, and your story may inspire someone else around the world. And one more thing. In the next story, I'll share a surprising journey about a person who almost gave up on their dream in America until one unexpected letter arrived and changed everything. The ending of that story shocked even me. So make sure you're subscribed, because you won't want to miss it. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, keep speaking, and keep believing that your best chapter may still be ahead. See you in the next story.